I'm ready to finalize my plans with a funeral director for direct cremation. I made an appointment and drove to the funeral home where I met with the owner, Brian Curnow. I verified the price I was given over the phone and then asked to see the plastic urn included in his basic cremation charge. He did have other urns available, but I told him my husband would be scattering my ashes, so we wouldn't need anything more than the plastic urn. I signed the cremation authorization, and Brian asked me questions while he filled out a death certificate worksheet on my behalf. We left a few spaces blank, like the date of death, county of death, and time of death. Brian took a few minutes and worked up the statement of goods and services. Now I could decide if I wanted to pay for the direct cremation by way of a trust or perhaps an insurance policy. And that completes direct cremation. It took about 20 minutes. I felt calm and in control the whole time. And if I had brought in a signed cremation authorization and a completed death certificate worksheet, I would have been finished in half the time. So if I died in January of 2009, my husband would pay the funeral home about $1,000 for my final arrangements with direct cremation. He would need at least 5 certified copies of my death certificate and most likely would want a modest obituary run in our local paper. The funeral home would help him write the obituary, but the paper charges an extra fee for a photograph and a set fee for each line of text, something to keep in mind the next time you consider writing a lengthy obituary with a photograph. Now it was time to talk with the funeral director about burial. Brian and I talked about my funeral plans. I told him I wanted to keep it simple, no church service, just a simple graveside service with family and a few close friends. I said I had been to the website and looked at caskets online, but Carlene had told me there was another book to look through at the funeral home. Brian showed me the casket book and left the room so I wouldn't feel rushed or pressured. I took about 15 minutes and made my decision, a pretty white metal casket. I was glad that the price was listed on each page. When Brian returned, he asked me questions and completed the death certificate worksheet. Funeral homes gather this information for the Department of Vital Statistics. Vital Statistics completes and certifies copies of the actual death certificate. The questions can feel a little personal, but they are required to be completed to the best of the funeral home's ability. Unlike cremation, burial does not require written authorization. You can bury anyone because, if need be, the body can be exhumed. Next, we talked about outer burial containers. Most cemeteries require the casket be placed into a concrete vault or liner if the casket is going underground. The vault or liner acts as a stabilizing agent for the casket and helps prevent the headstone from settling. I'm going with a concrete liner, which I will purchase from the cemetery. I didn't want viewing or embalming. I didn't want memorial folders or a guest book that friends and family could sign, and if my husband wanted to order flowers for the graveside service, that was something he could do on his own. Brian took a few minutes and worked up the statement of goods and services. I was relieved that the charges were what Carlene had said on the phone, except for the cost of the casket. Now I just needed to decide how I would pay for the burial with simple graveside service. The meeting with Brian took about 45 minutes. I was calm. There were no surprises because I knew what I wanted and had no fear of talking about it. If I wanted a memorial or a traditional funeral service, more time and money would be involved. I would need to view the chapel, select memorial folders and a guest book. I would need a detailed obituary with the time and location of my funeral. If I had pallbearers, I would need to get the information for the funeral director. Scripture, music, and poetry reading selections would need to be made. Other considerations that come with additional charges would be limousine service for my immediate family, whether or not I wanted police escorts, and who would officiate over the service. The list could go on, which is exactly why you should be specific when discussing your funeral requirements with your family or a funeral home. Wow, it feels like we should be done. But now we need to head to the cemetery and collect their charges. A funeral is a 2-part process, with the funeral home charges and the cemetery charges. I met with Terry Reynolds to collect my cemetery charges. Terry works for the City of Puyallup, and the City of Puyallup owns Woodbine Cemetery. Fortunately, Terry had an easy-to-read brochure addressing cemetery costs, and she highlighted charges I could expect to incur. We talked about a simple graveside service for immediate family and close friends. She gave me the setup fee for the tent, crib, chairs, and AstroTurf. and then charges for opening and closing the grave. Prices are not negotiable. Payment must be made prior to the burial with cash, check, or credit card. There are no payment plans for a burial. If you own property, you will still have funeral home expenses, opening and closing charges, setup charges for a tent and chairs, and eventually charges for a headstone and installation fees. Terry and I returned to the office to look at headstone options. My intention was to keep things simple and affordable. There was an option of a 24 by 12 inch granite marker at a cost of $301 plus tax and an installation charge of $235 plus tax. I decided there was no need to rush a decision for the headstone. Graves require 3 weeks to settle, and occasionally backfilling is required. Terry recommends that families look around the cemetery and make sure they order what they really want, because once it's set in stone, it's set in stone. So let's take a look at my cemetery charges for a burial at Woodbine Cemetery in January of 2009. Property for the burial is $1,395, and that's in the affordable section of the cemetery. Charges to open and close the grave, $720. Grave liner to encase the casket, $535, and a liner is less expensive than a burial vault. Graveside setup, $200, making a grand total with tax of $2,897.08. I did not include a headstone selection. That will be done at a later date, but I know it will be at least $550. Now let's add my cemetery charges to the funeral home expenses. Graveside service, $1,895. Attractive white metal casket, $1,095. Headstone, approximately $550. A modest obituary in a local paper, $200. 5 death certificates, $100, plus tax for a grand total of $6,834. Cost should be a natural consideration when making final arrangements for yourself or someone you love. In my case, I have a choice to make between a burial at about $7,000 and a direct cremation at about $1,000, and that's on the low side of final arrangements. The average service charge for direct cremation in King and Pierce County is $1,500. That does not include death certificate copies or an obituary. Make some phone calls and comparison shop, or prepare to pay a lot more than I will. If you want a burial, be responsible and start your homework today. Like cremation, there are vast swings in price at each funeral home for the same services and products. Funeral home fees are a non-regulated entity. Prices can change at any time. Like most other businesses, prices seem to increase every year. Stop being fearful and get on the phone. Print off the telephone questions and start gathering your price information. Tell your family what kind of arrangements you want, and then put it in writing. If you want to be cremated, authorize it today. Everyone should fill out a death certificate worksheet, whether your plans are for cremation or burial. So what are you waiting for? Go print off your forms and start making smart choices about final arrangements. Talk to your family and friends about this DVD and demystify the death care industry.